Hi, this is Art, and this is from my book, And Another Thing, an eclectic collection of musings, afterthoughts, and paternal rantings. In September of 1969, I joined the United States Army, and although it was by choice, I did feel that my options were somewhat limited at the time. I had just graduated from high school, and, well, let's just say I was not exactly what you would call college material at the time. The Vietnam conflict was at its height, and if I did nothing, I would surely be drafted and sent to the front. I decided to be proactive and enlist for a defensive missile that I knew was being used primarily in the United States and Europe. Now, anyone who has served in the military will tell you that that first week of basic training is something out of a bad dream. I was 19 years old and away from home for the first time in my life, and short of being sent to prison or finding out that you have some horrible disease, it was the worst feeling you can possibly imagine. In addition, I found myself surrounded by a bunch of guys that I just couldn't relate to at the time. They were dirt poor Southern boys, and they had come from a whole different world than the one I had known. Well, I was put on a bus with those guys for the all-night ride to Fort Bragg in North Carolina, and when we finally arrived at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, we were yelled at, stuck with needles, and kept standing for hours. The next afternoon, without having had any sleep the night before, we found ourselves sitting at long tables taking some kind of a written exam. I don't remember exactly what the purpose of the exam was, but it seemed pretty important at the time. As I sat there pondering the questions and multiple choice answers, I happened to notice the fella sitting to my right. He kept looking over at my paper, and I knew he was copying my answers. Instead of hiding my paper, I immediately moved it closer to him, and as inconspicuously as possible, I angled the page so that he could see it a little bit better. It wasn't something that I thought about. It wasn't something that I questioned or moralized. It was instinctive. The guy needed help, and I was able to easily provide it. End of story. I later found out that this particular gentleman's full-time occupation before he had been drafted was that of a garbage collector. Now, I'm not talking about your modern-day sanitary engineer that sits up in a cab and operates levers. This was the 1960s. I'm talking about a guy that spends his life picking up heavy cans of trash and emptying them into the back of a truck that he follows down the street. I'm talking about a guy that was probably unable, or at least had a high degree of difficulty comprehending the questions on that piece of paper. I'm talking about a guy that was totally lost. No words were spoken, no eye contact was made. I knew what he was doing, he knew what I was doing, and when the ordeal was over, we each stood up and walked away in different directions. I didn't give the matter another thought until several days later. It was hot in North Carolina, and on one particular afternoon, the DIs had us running around a track. Now, even though I was 19, I was in terrible shape. I was overweight, and I don't think I had ever run more than a half mile at any one time in my life. I was not what you would call an athletic kid. I was what you would call a lazy kid. I liked watching TV and staying in my room. But on this particular day, I found myself on a parade field, running and trying to catch my breath. I couldn't keep up with the other guys, and I knew I couldn't last much longer. I had already run out of steam, and I kept hoping that they'd give us a break at any moment, but they didn't. I also knew what would happen to me when I stopped running. I saw other guys who were in worse shape than me, and when they stopped running, the DIs simply went over to them and kicked them in their fat stomachs, yelling at them mercilessly the whole time until they got back up. There was no political correctness in those days. You were simply in the goddamned army, and you had better shape up or else. Well, I had lasted just about as long as I could. I was beginning to stumble, and I was finally ready to accept my fate in exchange for a few brief moments of rest. And then I suddenly felt someone grab my arm. And when I looked over, it was that guy from the test days earlier. I didn't even know his name, but in a heavy southern drawl, he said, "Come on, Blum, I ain't gonna let you quit on me now. I help you. We'll finish the run together. You can do it. We'll do it together." And with this man's help, plus the extra shot of adrenaline that I felt, we made it to the finish. When the ordeal was finally over and I put my hand on his shoulder to thank him, I knew that this guy was my friend. He from his world, and I from mine. The military teaches you many things. It teaches you that you are dependent upon one another for your very lives. It says that we live together, we eat together, and sometimes in the end, we must die together. It's kind of funny, but from time to time I still think about how he and I helped each other in that first terrible week, and I wonder if maybe he thinks about it a little bit too. I can't deny that I learned a lot in the military, but in those first few days, I learned some of life's most valuable lessons. I learned that everyone is good at some things and lousy at others. I learned that other folks aren't better than you or worse than you, just different. And I learned that a random act of kindness is never wasted and never forgotten. Thanks for watching. And by the way, if you like my vlogs, you can become a subscriber at the bottom of your screen. It's free and it'll help me out. And don't forget to give me a thumbs up too. Thanks.